A more clear ideological structuring might be of some value here. But how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories. We are trained Marxists.
Tonight we're going to be discussing the witchcraft of the riots. If you look at some of the headlines from this weekend, you find stories like this one from the Chicago Sun-Times, 85 shot, 24 fatally over Chicago's most violent weekend yet. Well, maybe that had something to do with police wanting to have the Ferguson effect of backing off of interventions while the violence and the looting and the gang and the criminal activity accelerates and escalates. Indeed, in that same context, you see headlines like D.A. Vance from New York City, Manhattan, declining to prosecute anyone arrested during the various rioting and looting activity that has taken place. In the same context, in fact, you had that headline from prosecutors in St. Louis, Missouri. You had it from police captains and police chiefs in Dallas, Texas. You had it in a range of cities, counties, and states across the country, to the degree that Minneapolis is now announcing it is going to disband its entire city police department. That's right, the BLM agenda of defund the police has now become an actual public policy recommendation and proposal in a major city in America. They have not exactly explained what it is that's supposed to replace it, beyond suggesting that merely calling 911 might be a sign of white privilege. That is the status of where things exist. You might think they were the product of some kind of witchcraft to see this sort of insanity and criminality seize our cities. In fact, there were riots in Brussels in Belgium. There were riots in London. There were riots in Paris. There was violence all across the world in some shape or form connected to these events and connected to these groups and connected to these mantras. In fact, including in London itself, where more than 27 officers were injured just this weekend in what the BBC still called mostly peaceful protests, despite all of those people getting injured and hurt. They were even throwing rocks at horses and knocking people off that caused major damage. CNN changed the headline to "Horse Goes Crazy at Local Protest." That is the kind of media coverage that has taken place in what looks like something that only could be brought up in a sort of in a witch's maelstrom. Well, in that context, in this case, there's actually a literal connection to some of this behavior and some of this conduct and some of the witchcraft, if you will. Take, for example, the Wikipedia entry for one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, the group, Patrisse Cullors. She's identified as a co-founder of Black Lives Matter. In fact, in some contexts, she's defined as and described as the founder of Black Lives Matter. And what's interesting is something that is later on in the Wikipedia entry that you'll see occasionally pop up in news stories about several of the co-founders of BLM. It's that she developed an interest in the Nigerian religious tradition of Ifa, incorporating its rituals into political protest events and trying to tap its quote-unquote spirituality to influence these political protest events. Well, what exactly is the Ifa tradition? Well, Ifa stems from the Yoruba religious tradition of Western Africa, which is in fact partially the foundation for things like Santeria, and as we know it more popularly here, voodoo. That's some of the ideological and intellectual strains and ancestry of the Ifa religious tradition. Indeed, in this article called African Spirituality Now, it describes it as witchcraft, divination, and healing. They even have a Yoruba word for witch, aye, in which they sometimes call them elders or mothers. Indeed, as the African Spirituality article details, many systems of what they call divination, and divination has another word in some contexts, otherwise called witchcraft by many. Of the many systems of divination used by the Yoruba, the most important is Ifa. So Ifa is what the Black Lives Matter co-founders described as being deeply part of and finds her spirituality from and uses, as in her own words, to influence her political protest movements and activities. Yoruba magical techniques and rites are prescribed by the various forms of activities that in their religious tradition. And in fact, the Yoruba word ogun refers to either magic or medicine. It's seen as indistinguishable and exchangeable with any other. So you actually have someone, now you might have a guess as to why BLM does not have tight ties to the Black Protestant Church or the Nation of Islam when its co-founders are deeply involved in religious traditions that have connections to things like voodoo and Santeria. Indeed, this trend has become an increasing trend, so much so that The Atlantic referred to the article as, quote, the witches of Baltimore, describing how increasingly within parts of the sort of neo-Marxist African-American political tradition and other political traditions are increasingly involved in various kinds of what others would be seen as witchcraft. Indeed, from this article, modern Black witches are practicing Yoruba-based faith with a few millennial touches. Describes it how its connections to Santeria, to Candomblé, to voodoo, to all of the other various branches of the Yoruba-based religious traditions. But this gives you an idea. Many Black witches, nervous about practicing witchcraft openly, feel more comfortable meeting online than in person. Indeed, you'd have to wonder whether the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, who knew each other before they started it and created it, there has been discussions in some parts of public media space that several of them have been deeply involved in this tradition. So you have the possibility of actual witches involved in running Black Lives Matter. That's how insane the world has become. In that same capacity, if we look at, that might help explain not only the kind of conduct that has been taking place, the kind of result you might expect when people decide to use their witchcraft to influence political protest, but it also explains either the lack of an agenda or where there has been an agenda, the radical destabilizing characteristics of that agenda. Indeed, if you go back to the 2016, where Black Lives Matter released its policy agenda, many of it are things like calling for collective employment, collective means of ownership, basically neo-Marxist solutions. Indeed, they say, quote, we seek radical transformation. And their goal was to have radical results as a consequence. This is why you don't see calls for simple civil rights solutions. This may also explain why the Black business class is generally not involved in Black Lives Matter, because there's an anti-capitalist tendency within the neo-Marxist influences of the movement. Now, they're happy to take donations from big corporations and billionaires, but that doesn't stop or limit or constrict their desire to completely undo the American experiment.